All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All protocols observed. Welcome to part A of session 5 of the TIPS Forum on unlocking non-tariff barriers for regional integration. For this session, for this part of the session, we've got presentations delivered by Dr. William Gaviyau, a postdoc fellow with UNISA's Department of Finance, Risk Management and Banking. We've also got Tshephisho Selatole, a lecturer at the Peninsula University with a background in quantity surveying and a growing focus on infrastructure development and financing. All right, without further ado, let us invite our first speaker up. That's Dr. William Gaviyau, who will be speaking to us about the role of logistics in achieving AfCFTA goals, challenges, and solutions.
Thank you very much. All protocols observed. I'm going to talk about the role of logistics in achieving AfCFTA goals, challenges, and solutions. As we all know, this is my roadmap. I'm going to talk about the introduction, the role of logistics in AfCFTA, the case of landlocked countries in Africa, the challenges and solutions, and then the conclusion. So the introduction, I think this part has been talked about by many people about the aim of AfCFTA, what it aims to create. It aims to create a single market, continental market for goods and services. At the same time, it will be the largest free trade area with that will be able to connect 1.3 billion people across 55 countries. And at the end of the they want to promote intra-Africa trade. Africa's total trade accounts for 3% of the world, while intra-Africa trade is estimated at 15% of Africa's total trade. So if you actually see on the slides there are expectations. I think those have been talked about. So let me just move on to the next. So before we delve much into what AfCFTA is, let's also look at the critical success factors that would actually make AfCFTA to be a success. So the first one is the political will. When we talk of the political will, what are we saying? What are we talking about? We're talking about, as you all know, AfCFTA itself, there are 49 countries that have ratified. But if you look at Africa, how many countries are there? There are 55. So meaning that there's a gap of 6 countries that have not ratified. So in that aspect, it also tells us that there's a gap that is there. And then if we also look at the political will, we can also look at the TFTA, which is the tripartite free trade area. I'll talk about that, but it was ratified some time back, but in terms of participation, there's very little that has happened. And then the other thing that we also need to look at is the issue of tariffs. When you look at tariffs, what are we talking about? We're talking about these are the charges that are going to be levied on the goods that are being exported or imported. Now, what is going to happen is that with the AfCFTA, what is going to happen is that we're going to remove some of these tariffs. It means that the revenue that is going to go to the government is going to be limited. As you all know that the governments, they rely, most of their income comes from taxes and duties. So what is going to happen? In as much as the AfCFTA have got a plan in place, is it going to be sustainable? It's a question that I will leave to you guys. And then there's also the issue of non-tariff barriers. When you look at non-tariff barriers, what are we talking about? Those technical issues. If you want to export your goods, let's say from South Africa to go to Uganda, what is expected is that your goods are supposed to have certain standards that they're supposed to comply with. So what is happening is that South Africa has got its own standards, Uganda has got its own standards. So what it entails is that each country has got its own standards. So what is going to happen? Is trade going to happen? They need to harmonize all these kind of standards. And also look at the issue of the payment. We all prefer to trade in US dollar. Why do you prefer to trade in US dollar? It's the easiest currency, isn't it? But is it going to be sustainable? Not at all. So under the non-tariff barriers, we've got quite a number of issues. We also have the issue of logistics, the road network. We've also looked at the road network that exists or that connects our countries. not at all. And then there's the issue of RECs, Regional Economic Community. These ones, there are issues there. Have you addressed these issues that are affecting these RECs? Because these are supposed to save this as a contributor to AfCFTA. If there are problems within the RECs, it means that the AfCFTA level, the problems are going to be much, much higher. So as part of the regional integration, we have those trade blocks. We have SADC, COMESA, EAC, all those are trade blocks. And you actually see that the countries, they have got overlapping trade blocks, the overlapping membership of these trade blocks. Why do they have to be a member of 2 or 3 trade blocks? That's a question that I'll leave to you guys. So now, let's look at the logistics. No one thinks of logistics. We've all been talking about trade, but no one has talked about logistics. Because for goods to move from point A to point B, is need to be an efficient logistic system in place. As long as it is not there, trade is not going to happen. We can dream of trade, but if this is not addressed, we are going to face challenges. So what are the objects? When we talk of trade, when we talk of logistics, it's intangible nature. It's a service that is provided. So most people, they ignore that. And then, so there's also a direct relationship with the trade in goods. I know I've been talking of trade, but there's trade in goods and trade in services. So this part of logistics, those are kind of services that are being offered. And then, what are the options that are there? We have got air, transport, road, sea, rail. And then in terms of the earnings, I went on the trade map. For those that are familiar with the trade map, there's a tab that looks at the logistics earnings. So the logistics earnings that have been recorded over the 5-year period, the highest was in 2022, it was 97 billion. Is the total trade, while the lowest amount was 70.12 billion in 2023. So you actually see that the earnings of the logistics are on average 6% of the total trade in products. And the earnings are mainly dominated by countries with ports, Egypt, South Africa, and Morocco. And then, for us to be able to actually analyze the problem of logistics, there is a Logistics Performance Index that was developed by World Bank in 2007, which is a perception-based index. So this index covers 6 dimensions, which cover policy and performance. So you actually see that on these ones, on the area of policy, is the issue of customs, infrastructure, and service quality. And then on the area of service delivery, timeliness, international shipments, tracking, and tracing. So this is the index that we are going to use to evaluate the performance of the logistics in Africa. So now, we are zeroing in on landlocked African countries. Yes, we have been talking of trade, but have you also been talking about landlocked countries? No. We're only focusing on those countries that have got access to ports. So if you look at Africa, 16 countries that are landlocked. And look at those ones that are in yellow, those are the mainly landlocked countries. So for trade to happen, let's say Botswana wants to trade with Ethiopia. What are the options that are there? Either they have to go through South Africa if they have to use the port, and then it goes to Somalia, it goes to Kenya, and then it goes to Ethiopia. If it goes to Somalia, there's war there. So nothing is going to go through. So the only remaining option is to go through to Kenya. So all of these issues, they've got an effect in terms of the price of the goods that are being sold in that country. So now, let's look at the trade opportunities that do exist. Let's say for Botswana in Africa. There's something that I want to show there. So you actually see that for Botswana, in terms of this information, is I actually received it from the ITC trade portal. So you actually see that for Botswana, in terms of their opportunities in Southern Africa, they have got the greatest potential in Southern Africa. And then Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and Northern Africa is trade that is less than 100 million potential. And then if you look at Ethiopia, that trade potential, we have got mainly not in Eastern Africa. Northern Africa, there is minimal, which is less than 100 million. Okay, what does this tell us? What it tells us is that for these countries, yes, in as much as you might talk of Botswana can actually trade with Ethiopia, Botswana can trade with DRC, or it can trade with Nigeria. The greatest potential lies within their neighbors. Why so? It's because of logistics. In as much as there are opportunities that are there. So you see, for Zimbabwe to Uganda, those are the products that can be exported to Uganda by Zimbabwe. The same applies to Botswana. Those are the products that can be exported to DRC. But if you go back now to our map, how easy is it to transport these goods? Given that most of the products that are exported, they need to use land transport. If you want to use air, it becomes very, very expensive. If you think of air, do you have any connecting flights between the two countries? No. Someone was saying that it is actually cheaper to get a connecting flight in outside Africa and then come back to DRC than it is to go from Botswana to DRC. That's the reality that we do have to face in Africa. So we need to address those issues. Oh, 2 minutes. Oh. So if you look at the opportunities that do exist with the countries that are non-landlocked, they've got a lot of opportunities because they've got a sea access. And then there is the logistics performance index. It shows us that the scores for each country, if it is above 3, there's high confidence. If it is lower than 3, there's low confidence. If it is 3, it's moderate. And then if you actually see that for all these landlocked countries, the one that is the highest, it's Uganda and Botswana. But it is between 2.5 and 2.7. For the others, is below 2.5, meaning that the logistic performance for these countries is very, very low. And then I've showed the average score for each country. I think this can be available to anyone. So in terms of the challenges, we have got overlapping regional membership. If you look at the landlocked countries, their membership is there. So I talked about all this, and then also the relevance of the TFT. It's still relevant for us to talk of the TFT, which aimed to consolidate COMESA, SADC, and EAC, given that there are problems that are there that they have not solved concerning the issue of logistics. And then there's the issue of connectivity. There's a lack of shared infrastructure. Uganda has got its own goals, Zimbabwe has got its own goals, South Africa has got its own goals. Why you have that when you are aiming for a single market? What it tells is that we need to sort out the issue of logistics. We need to have a shared vision that is shared by each and everyone, and also the private sector. Let this not be led by the government only, but also the private sector. And then the solutions, I'm left with 34 seconds. So in terms of the solutions, there's the issue of regional value chain that has been talked about. That's another option that can be, that we can actually look at. Regional value chain has got its own problems because we have not solved the issue of access to raw materials, the issue of logistics. And then there is the issue of finance infrastructure development. Yes, we have got companies that have been financed by Upper Zimbabwe and EDB, but it's just a drop in the ocean for the others. Should we have public or private partnerships, or should we have public-led projects? I would doubt that. I think the best is to have private sector-led projects. And then the other solution is to have airports. So this has been used by many landlocked countries. I think that's, and then there's also the issue of digital infrastructure. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gaviyau, for that very insightful presentation. We now welcome to the podium Tshephisho Selatole, who will be taking us through her presentation on trade enabling transport infrastructure, investment impact on regional economic development and integration in SADC.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Whilst I wait for my presentation to be loaded, my name is Tshephisho Selatole. I'm currently a lecturer at the Peninsula University of Technology. What I'll be presenting on today is my master's research study that I did last year, focusing on trade enabling transport infrastructure investment impact on regional economic growth, as well as regional integration. Okay, so I've already done the intros. Okay, just some of the things that I'll be running through. Look at the problem statement, the theoretical framework, empirical literature, but my focus is mainly going to be on the results and the discussion, because I think that's where value can be derived in terms of what my study actually looked into. Right, just a bit of an introduction when it comes to the transport infrastructure landscape. I think quite a few of our colleagues have spoken to this during the day, but we do know that transport infrastructure, specifically looking at transport corridors from a trade perspective, those are essential for facilitating regional trade, as well as driving economic development across Africa's various regions. Right, so with the implementation of the AfCFTA, there is a strategic opportunity that is presented to enhance integration among the member states of the various regions that we have in the continent. And this can be accomplished through improved multimodal transport systems, as well as facilitation. And when it came to the significance of my study, just mainly looked at how transport infrastructure, specifically high quality, right? Because we can have transport infrastructure, but it have a lot of deficiencies, which essentially hinder trade. Right, so high quality transport infrastructure improves trade competitiveness. It also attracts investment, and it also supports sustained economic growth in any region, really. Right, but as we as a continent move towards the implementation of the AfCFTA, it becomes very crucial and very critical for us to address the infrastructure development gap, as well as the financing gap that exists. Okay, so my study essentially aimed to analyze how investments in transport infrastructure impact regional economic growth and integration, which I already touched on. Okay, our problem statement. Unfortunately, as a continent, the current landscape of our continent when it comes to transport infrastructure, we are faced with a lot of deficiencies when it comes to infrastructure development, right? Not just in transport, but across the board, right? So we're suffering from severe underdevelopment, as well as maintenance deficiencies. We're struggling with underdeveloped or inadequately developed roads, railways, suboptimal ports that are also quite congested. And so there is quite a critical shortfall when it comes to infrastructure development, which has ultimately or which is impeding trade efficiency as well as economic growth, right? And regional integration in the SADC region, but not only in the SADC region, I'd say within the continent as a whole. Right, so there is economic potential that remains untapped due to this, that if there are certain improvements made, we can that can positively contribute towards our economic growth, economic development, as well as regional integration in the continent. Okay, one of the theories that my study was influenced by was the gravity model of international trade. I think one of our colleagues also touched on this earlier, which was espoused by Tinbergen in 1962. And then that theory basically suggests that transport infrastructure reduces trade costs, and it also significantly increases trade volumes between countries. The other studies that were conducted that essentially built on Tinbergen's model, right, that also supported his works from Verena, Han, and Quinn, that also showed that infrastructure enhancements expand the range of tradable products, so the products that we're able to trade amongst each other's countries. It also enhances participation in our global value chains, right, and it also acts as a catalyst for economic integration. Empirical evidence, and there are a few studies that I had to look into that basically supports what I wanted to look into whilst I was doing the study. And that looked at the impact on trade, or studies that that looked at impact on trade, impact on economic growth, as well as regional integration. And one of the studies that I came across that was quite interesting, specifically on transport infrastructure's impact on trade, was the study by Sheehan and Nabels in 2001, in which their study showed that a decline in infrastructure quality reduced trade volumes by up to 28%. Right, that is quite a significant reduction. They used the gravity model for that study. And then there was a study that was done by Muva Wala et al. I'll highlight that because that's a study that focused on Uganda, right? And in their study, they used an autoregressive distributed like model. It showed that infrastructure, specifically road infrastructure investments, have a short-term negative impact, but in the long term, it does yield positive impact. Right, then looking at a study that looked at the impact of regional integration was one by Fujimura and Edmonds in 2006. They also used a gravity model in which their study showed that developing cross-border roads actually boosts intra-regional trade. Right, their studies showed elasticities that range from 0.6 to 1.4, and that essentially just speaks to the substantial trade responsiveness to infrastructure development and investment. Okay, oh, sorry. The methodology, the overall methodology approach that I used was a quantitative panel analysis model. And then the estimation technique that I essentially used was the pooled mean group autoregressive distributed like model, but usually we just refer to that as the PMG. So that's the model we used for the study. The period we looked at was from 2007 to 2021. Would have been great to, look at the study further, but due to data access restriction, we're limited to that period. Countries that we analyzed was Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, and Tanzania. And what these countries all have in common is that they are coastal countries, though they do have ports. We wanted to highlight the importance that ports actually have when it comes to the impact that transportation infrastructure has on economic growth and regional integration. Okay, so we chose the PMG model because we wanted to be able to analyze not only long-term effects or the relationships between the various variables, we also wanted to look at it from a short term, so short term and long term. Okay, some of the variables that we had, I had two models essentially because I wanted to look at the impact on economic growth and the impact on regional integration. And so that meant that I'd have two models that I needed to run. So we had the regional GDP growth representing economic growth. And then we had the regional trade to GDP ratio. So the trade to GDP ratio was used as a variable to represent regional integration. Yep. And then the independent variables that we had, and I'm just going to fly through this because I am limited time-wise, was the ID, the African Infrastructure Development Index. We used the transport component specifically, right? But this also, you could say it was a proxy because the transport component only looks at road networks or the extent to which roads have been constructed in the continent. So we use that as a proxy. We also use gross fixed capital formation as a proxy when it comes to capital investments, because unfortunately when it comes to data access, that was also a bit challenging. We did try through NEPID to get some of the data, but it was also challenging as there's quite a lot of gaps with regards to that. Okay, we also had a few control variables, inflation, government spending, and lending interest rates. So this was my model. So the model one that essentially we ran to analyze the impact of those various independent variables on regional GDP growth. Both models were essentially the same. What was different between the two was that due to multicollinearity, there were certain variables, specifically when it comes to control variables, that we had to drop. But in terms of the model being able to analyze both short-term and long-term effects, it did the same thing essentially. Okay. Okay, so the results for model one in the long run. Right, so I'm just going to focus on the transport variables and some of the some of the trade variables. So with the ID showed that it did have a significant positive impact. So transport infrastructure development does have a statistically positive impact, had a coefficient of 1.097. The GFCF also was statistically significant, and it did have a positive impact, or showed to have a positive impact. Also looking at net trade, right, it was statistically significant, however, it had a negative impact. And we'll speak to that in the discussion as to why that is. Okay, in model two, for the regional to trade, or to trade to GDP, regional integration model, our ID once again was statistically significant, although it was marginal. And GFCF was also statistically significant. Our net trade was also statistically significant, although it was also marginal. Also looked at some of the MFN tariffs just to see the trade openness of the region with other regions and across the globe. Our short run results for both model 1 and model 2 were all statistically insignificant. Yeah. So just a bit of discussion on the results that we've just seen and the interpretation of that. So we saw that the ID had a positive and significant effect, where 1% increase in infrastructure development would essentially lead to a 1.09% increase in our economic growth, or our GDP growth. So that suggests that transport infrastructure does boost connectivity, but also boosts economic activity, boosts economic growth. Right, our GFC was also statistically significant. Right, 1% increase that led to an increase of 7.91% in growth. But remember also this was a proxy, right? So in that there's also other forms of infrastructure and so forth. But just to speak to the capital investment impact also. Right. So they just confirmed that transport infrastructure also plays a crucial. We do need to invest more in transport infrastructure. So the net trade, 2 minutes. Okay. Net trade, the negative impact, it just revealed or implied that there are trade deficits. There are quite a lot of countries in our region that have high net trade deficits, and that essentially is hindering regional economic growth and development, and therefore we do need to promote more exports. Okay. And then the long-run discussion on the regional integration model. ID also remained positively significant, even though it was marginal. I'd say that also speaks to the level of infrastructure development in the region. There is still more work to do. And I believe that if more was to be invested and developed, this would also change. The GFC also statistically significant, also just confirming the importance of capital investments as a key enabler. Net trade was positive and significant, and that for us has suggested that higher intertrade within the SADC region does essentially strengthen integration. And then with the tariffs, those were insignificant, and that basically just implies that tariffs alone are not sufficient. We need to invest more in or apply more non-tariff measures, invest more in infrastructure. But the short-run implications, so with those, they're just indicative of the delayed nature in which the investments in transport infrastructure actually take. So there's a delayed nature in terms of as material or the tangible economic outcomes actually materializing. It takes time. Okay. Quickly in closing, I don't know how I have 30 seconds. I'll just quickly close. Right, so positive long-run effects of the ID and the GFC. Those just confirm that investments in roads, in rail, in ports are essential for enabling trade and boosting economic growth in the region. Right, we need to focus more on imports. We need to focus more on implementing non-tariff measures, right? Reducing bureaucratic border control procedures, licensing, and all of that. So regional integration, unfortunately, still remains low, despite our existing frameworks, which are great. But we do need stronger coordination mechanisms for tracking infrastructure impacts. But I think also what is critical is the alignment of policies, of national policies within the SADC region, because there are countries that are, for example, with the SADC FTA, not all countries are active. I think 13 of the 16, unless that's changed since 2022. Okay, last wrapping up. So transport infrastructure, that does serve as a critical enabler. And we do need to invest more in our regional corridors. We have the Maputo corridor, we have the Walvis Bay corridor, the Dar es Salaam, the north to south corridor. All of these corridors, right, are the backbone of trade. And so therefore we do need to do a lot more in terms of investing in and developing these enablers of trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tshephisho, for that wonderful presentation. I do have a soft spot for econometric modeling, so I thoroughly enjoyed that one. So we'll just do around about 10 minutes of Q&A. If we can, there are a few questions online, about 1 or 2 came through online. If we could maybe get 2 or 3 from the room.
Thank you very much. I have 3 questions, one for Gaviyau and then the other for Selatole. Okay, so for Gaviyau, I wanted to ask, how can the coastline nations maintain their local standards while still fostering good relationships with landlocked countries? You mentioned the whole rating situation and how the gridlocked countries can benefit. So I was just wondering what can actually happen for that sovereign state in the coastline to still continue with their own profit margins and their own deals, and then on top have the trade regulated dealings with the gridlocked countries. Then for Selatole, the first question is, what were the main inhibitants that affected growth of transport infrastructure within any of the nations, your Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, and Tanzania? Then my second question is, were you able to model the revenue shortfall from the lack of maintenance in infrastructure? And was there a GDP change or anything of the sort? And I too am a fan of the econometric modeling, so thank you.
All right. Thank you for those questions, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give our presenters the chance to respond.
Okay. Thank you for the questions that you have asked concerning the issue of the coastal countries, how they can foster the relationship with the gridlocked countries. I think as a solution to this, it goes back. Remember what I said about the critical success factors, the issue of the political will. So it requires the political leaders to actually say, yes, we need to work with these landlocked countries so that we can come up with a solution. As long as there is no that political will, it's not going to happen. And that needs to be discussed at regional levels where you have got your SADC, your COMESAs. That's where they need to discuss all these issues. And if you look at it, in SADC, we have got the trade agreement, and there are problems that are existing concerning this issue. The same applies to COMESA. Why can they not be solved at that level? It can be at that level, regional level, or it can be at bilateral level. We have got countries that have got these coastal countries. They've got bilateral trade agreements with the landlocked countries. They can also solve these issues at that level, as long as the leaders are not able to solve at that level. Let's say at bilateral level, even at SADC level. Will they be able to solve it now at AfCFTA level? That's the question that I can also ask you guys. That's my response.
I'll speak to the question that you had about the main inhibitants when it comes to infrastructure development and investments. I'd say the first that comes to mind is definitely financing. And what I mean by financing, more so when it comes to the funding aspect of it. So there could be funding, but you tend to find that a lot of projects, or some projects, are considered to be not bankable, right? There's various risk elements that come into play there. So now you're looking into what innovative financing mechanisms can we then introduce into the public-private sector space, right? So that we're able to accelerate development. So you're seeing a lot of blended financing coming into play. You're seeing a lot of triple Ps coming into play. But those essentially became more prominent because we needed to de-risk our projects so that they are bankable and they can go from plan to actual physical, structures fulfilling the purpose for which they were intended, right? So another thing that came to mind was just from a South African perspective. There was a study that I did when I was doing my honors that looked at the projectification processes that municipalities go in terms of taking their independent, their development plans from a plan into the actual physical structure. What does that look like? And the municipalities that I had sampled, this is a while back. So I think now you have UNISA, right? You have all these bodies. I think ISA also has a program now running. I think they started it this year that essentially assists municipalities in terms of rolling out the infrastructure development plan. So the challenge is that we have a plan. But how do we take that plan into actual physical infrastructure that is also can operate throughout the life cycle of that particular project. And if you're looking at, for example, road infrastructure, you're also looking into cash revenue. Will that project be able to generate cash flows over the years? Will we be able to then, if we're looking at a funding model where we also have public and private partnership kind of dynamic in there, or we have a project financing model, right? I'm not sure if you are aware of project financing. So we have project financing models where you have a special vehicle or a special purpose vehicle company that is established, right? And then there we have debtors, we have various funders, equity from an equity and debt perspective, right? So we're looking at can this project also generate the cash flows that are needed in order to pay back what we need, but also to sustain the project, to ensure that we're able to cover maintenance over the year that this particular project needs to run. So for me, I think it's financing, but other people could tell you there's a whole lot more there. There's political issues, challenges that also come into play, right? There's national policies that come into play when it comes to infrastructure development, implementation specifically. So there are various challenges, but I would say, because my study also focused a bit more on the financing aspect and some of the challenges that are quite prominent in that space. So I don't know if that answers you, but hopefully that does answer you. With regards to the revenue shortfall, no, I did not look into that, but that would have been very interesting to see what the outcome of that would have been. Maybe something for me to look into when I do my PhD worth considering. So thank you for that suggestion.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of part A of session 5. We'll now take a 20-minute tea break, and we'll resume in 20 minutes for part B, still on unlocking NTBs for regional integration. One more round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.